Icons of evolution, Haeckel's embryos. So one of the common icons of evolution to see in textbooks, even still now, although I'm sure with updated technology that allows for more precise showing of evidence and the way the real world is scientifically, it is still common to see something like this in textbooks as evidence for naturalistic evolution. And this embryo or embryology, an embryo is obviously a lower stage developmentally of a living creature. And Haeckel is the name of the person who formulated these images that we see on the screen. Haeckel's embryos are often used as an argument for evolution, arguing basically that because embryos look similar in their their earlier stages of development, that therefore that indicates a common ancestor between them. Meaning this, if the fish, the human, and so on, other embryos look similar at their embryonic early states of development, then it makes sense that they all at one point have a common ancestry, even though they grow into creatures that look very different. Now, I think philosophically, number one, there could be an argument there that just because things look the same at an earlier stage of development, that it's maybe a logical leap to get to the point of saying, therefore, they must have had common ancestry. That being said, there are other problems with this icon of evolution. Jonathan Wells explains in Icons of Evolution that Darwin knew that the Cambrian fossil record, as we've talked about before, was a serious problem for his theory. Darwin wrote in Origin of Species, says, it seems to me the leading facts in embryology, study of creatures in their embryonic state, the leading facts in embryology, which are second to none in importance, are explained on the principles of variations in the many descendants from some one ancient progenitor. In other words, that why do creatures in their embryonic states look so similar, but end up growing up into vastly different looking creatures and different functioning creatures? And Darwin said that this is evidence of some one ancient progenitor, common ancestor from which, with variations, we all evolved. Went on to say, the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but become, when fully developed, widely dissimilar. So he thought, okay, well, if they look similar in their embryonic stage of development, but end up looking vastly different and dissimilar when they're more fully developed, then this is an indication that sameness on the earlier stages indicates common ancestry. Also said, early embryos show us more or less completely the condition of the progenitor of the whole group in its adult state. So basically, that what these creatures look like in embryo, including human beings, is close to what the adult state of the ancient progenitor, this creature from which we evolved, looked like. Now, so the claim, as I've said, is that similarities in early embryos of different species demonstrate that they are descended from a common ancestor. Additionally, it was claimed that the early embryos gave us a clue to what that common ancestor looked like. So these are the claims made by Darwin based on these pictures, these drawings from around Darwin's time by Haeckel that are supposed to be different embryos at different stages of development of different creatures, showing presumably that they all look the same or very similar at the earliest stages of development. He goes on to say, this is by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of the theory. So Origin of Species was produced after Haeckel's work. Haeckel's Embryos, Professor Haeckel, according to Darwin, brought his great knowledge and abilities to bear on what he calls phylogeny, or the lines of descent of all organic beings. In drawing up the several series, he thrusts chiefly the embryological characters. Okay, so here's Haeckel's embryos. So he says, see, okay, these different creatures that look different once they're fully developed, but looked a lot similar at their earliest stages. Okay, so he has here embryos left to right. Fish, the salamander, tortoise, the chick, the hog, the calf, the rabbit, and the human. So it's, this figure says, note that only 5 of the 7 vertebrate classes are represented and that half of the embryos are mammals. This version of Haeckel's drawings from George Romain's book, Darwinism Illustrated. So this is a very common thing to see a biology textbook or some other textbook discussing evolution. Haeckel made several of these drawings. Most famous were the early vertebrate embryos, which are on the right, and vertebrate meaning usually it has a backbone, has some type of a spine, has a skeletal structure. Drawings show classes of vertebrates with virtually identical at the earliest stages. Embryos become noticeably different as they develop in this picture. And then it appears to be a strong evidence of common ancestry. Meaning if we all looked the same in our embryonic stage, maybe we all did have a common ancestor. Darwin regarded the evidence as so convincing that he said in Origin of Species, quote, "It is probable from what we know of the embryos of mammals, birds, fishes, and reptiles that these animals are modified descendants of some ancient progenitor." In Descent of Man, Darwin said the human embryo itself at a very early period can hardly be distinguished from that of other members of the vertebrate kingdom. Humans and other vertebrates, he said, pass through the same early stages of development. He said we ought frankly to admit their community of descent. Now, here's the problem. Haeckel's drawings were, and this is not a conspiracy theory of a tinfoil hat wearing person. This is a known fact in the history of science that Haeckel's drawings were a hoax. They were faked. He faked his drawings in order, well, we don't really know his motives fully. And we don't have to, because this is not the accurate state of what embryos look like at their earliest stages. Now, they may look similar at different stages and what have you, but he faked the drawings and he rearranged the drawings to make it look like the embryos were more similar at earlier stages than was actually the case. And so here on the left, figure 5.2 of this book on icons of evolution, it's more accurately what embryos look like at their earliest stages and so on. They're not as similar. Jonathan Wells writes, biologists have known for over a century that Haeckel faked his drawings. Vertebrate embryos never look as similar as he made them out to be. So we don't know why exactly he faked his drawing, but we do know this was seen as primary evidence for common ancestry. But even after being known for a century, and it takes things time to develop and correct, whatever the case may be fair to that. But these drawings of Haeckel's were still being used in textbooks and as evidence for naturalistic evolution for a long time afterward, and are still in many textbooks today. So the graphic on the left contrasts Haeckel's drawings with actual vertebrate embryos. Also, the stage Haeckel labeled first is actually midway through the development. So not only did he fake the actual drawings, but the ones he did get right, he changed the order of in order to put the ones that looked similar closer toward what he called the beginning or the earliest stages, even though it may have been a later stage for one, an earlier stage for another. He adjusted the data in order to fit this theory. This guy, Carl Ernst von Baer, was Europe's most famous embryologist before the publication of Origin of Species, and he trained in physics and biology. He wrote his major work on embryology in the mid-1830s. Baer's law of embryology is in 4 general characteristics, and he supposedly refuted what was called pre-formationism, the old idea that embryos are simply miniature adults. So the thought was back then that there was some theory that embryos are just really, really small versions of their what they develop into as they are fully grown. So he showed that that wasn't the case. They look a lot different. And he also refuted the law of parallelism, the idea that embryos of higher organism pass through adult forms of lower organisms in development. So that, in other words, that higher organisms, like human beings, don't go through all the stages of lower organisms first to arrive at this point of where they've continued to develop. So he refuted that idea of parallelism. He said, the more general characters of a large group of animals appear earlier in their embryos than the more special characteristics. So the embryos, tend to look more similar in their earlier stages than later. Also says the embryo of a higher form never resembles any other form, but only its embryo. Okay, these were summaries of actual empirical observations about embryos. So that von Baer was looking at the data and looking at embryos over and over and over again to develop these empirical justifications of his theory. And they also emphasized the importance of careful observation. He had the discovery of the tiny mammalian egg, which is in mammals, this egg that grows around the embryo, and then accepted the possibility of limited transformation of species based on what is contained within the embryos. He theorized that the possibility that there could only be limits on these things. He saw no evidence for the large-scale transformations proposed by Darwin and did not believe in various species of vertebrates descended from a common ancestor. Now, the historian of science, Timothy Lenoir, said that von Baer feared Darwinists had, quote, already accepted the Darwinian hypothesis as true before they set to the task, set to the task of observing embryos. You read that again. Historian of science, Timothy Lenoir, said that von Baer, this scientist that was doing empirical research in the area of embryology, that he feared that Darwinists had, quote, already accepted the Darwinian hypothesis as true before they set to the task of observing the embryos. That's not how empirical science is supposed to work. You do set out a hypothesis of how you think the world is supposed to be, but the empirical data is supposed to give validity or lack thereof to your theory. But the problem is if you presuppositionally accept a theory or a hypothesis as true, and then only look at information that seemingly confirms your hypothesis, you run into this problem of confirmation bias, where we tend to want to believe things and then only look at evidence that seems to confirm it. When empirical science is supposed to be observable, testable, and repeatable, and should, as kind of Sherlock Holmes put it, you get theories from facts, not facts from theories. And so von Baer started to fear, according to Lenoir, this historian of science, that many had already accepted the Darwinian hypothesis as true before they set to the task of observing the embryo. So if you already accept something as true without testing it scientifically in the world of empirical science, you're no longer doing empirical science. You have now undermined the very foundation of empirical science, which is that of empirical observation. Darwin ended citing von Baer as a source to support his theory. Now, von Baer says these things, even though von Baer may have had some level of agreement in some ways with the idea of evolution, had some pretty serious differences and critiques of the Darwinian model. But Darwin ends up citing von Baer as support for his theory. Darwin wrote, generally the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but become, when fully developed, widely dissimilar. A better proof of this latter fact cannot be given than the statement of von Baer that, quote, the embryos of mammals, birds, lizards, and snakes, and probably turtles, are in their earliest states exceedingly like one another. In my possession are two little embryos in spirit whose names I have omitted to attached. And at present, I am quite unable to say to what class they belong. They may be lizards or small birds or very young mammals. So complete is the similarity in the mode of formation that the head of the trunk, formation of the head and trunk in these animals. So Darwin quotes von Baer as supposedly saying that embryos are also similar, that even when there are two that he didn't write down exactly what they were and categorize them, he couldn't tell the differences after a while because they were so similar. But the problem is von Baer may have exaggerated, because the embryos of lizards, birds, and mammals can be distinguished at a very early stage. And von Baer also saw no evidence for Darwin's theory of a common ancestor. So the fact that he used von Baer to back up evidence for a theory for which von Baer did not agree is problematic. And he also, von Baer never claimed that embryos look like the adult of another species. So Darwin is kind of quoting von Baer out of context and making it sound like he agreed with certain aspects of Darwin's theories, which in fact he did not. Darwin wrote, after citing von Baer as an authority, something that disagreed with von Baer, he said, it is probable from what we know of the embryos of mammals, birds, fishes, and reptiles that these animals are modified descendants of some ancient progenitor. With many animals, the embryonic or larval stages show us more or less completely the condition of the progenitor of the whole group in its adult state. So Darwin cited von Baer as an authority for a position that von Baer did not hold. It's an example of academic dishonesty. Darwin also distorted the evidence, either mistakenly or intentionally, and the literature to make it fit his theory. He also claimed common ancestry, and that embryos look like adults of other animals, the exact opposite of what von Baer observed in the natural world and what he wrote in his books about his scientific discoveries. So here are the early stages in vertebrate embryos. They're pretty distinct. And we can see that this is a case of academic dishonesty. Haeckel presenting fake evidence as genuine, and then Darwin is misquoting, misrepresenting the ideas and words of Haeckel. Now, we leave open some empathy historically for the fact that there is room for misunderstanding or misquoting, but this is rarely seen, known, or corrected in either Darwin or Haeckel. And even though Haeckel's drawings are faked and inaccurate, they still pervade many textbooks as evidence for the theory of evolution. Now, most scientists know, or at least biologists, I would assume, and embryologists, know that this is not the case, and they know the infamous story of Haeckel and all this. But the kind of rank and file person studying science, the layman studying science, is still being told by this falsehood. What looks like to be convincing evidence is actually that evidence of this theory, when in actuality it is not. And so this is another icon of evolution that ought to be removed or at least corrected in the history of science. And the good thing about science is that it can be self-correcting. People have looked back and were able to observe these things and find the mistake. But it is also an example that human beings can and do bring in our biases to every area of study, that we bring in presuppositions, and that we have to make sure that those presuppositions are fundamentally correct, logically coherent, because otherwise, if they're not, they can lead us to misrepresent the data, either intentionally or accidentally.